mean arterial pressure. Now, mean arterial pressure is interesting. As I mentioned, the word mean does not mean arithmetic mean. Uh, this is basically we are looking at uh, a minute to minute or a millisecond of blood pressure variation. Uh, so there's a time component to it. It's roughly an average blood pressure over a period of time. Yes, that's the way. It's an averaged blood pressure reading over a span of a unit of time. Uh, and this is how mean arterial pressure is basically defined. Its formula, there are multiple formulas, but I think the simplest mentioned in Guyton is it's diastolic pressure plus 1/3 of pulse pressure. You know what pulse pressure is now. Pulse pressure is systolic pressure minus diastolic pressure. So in this formula, diastolic pressure comes twice. Once in the definition of pulse pressure, and one the whole pulse pressure, diastolic pressure itself. So, and this is what I mentioned in the initial diagram as well, if you remember, that your mean arterial pressure is closer to the diastolic pressure than to the systolic pressure. Now you see the mathematical form of this right here. Diastolic pressure plus 1/3 of pulse pressure. Remember, MCQs and SEQs can be designed, and rather are designed for you to calculate from the given data mean arterial pressure. So beware, such questions are commonly given in circulation tests. Okay, one other thing about this is that if you remember your heart physiology, the heart spends more time in diastole as compared to systole at normal heart rates. So when the human being is at rest, the heart is passing more time in diastole than systole, i.e., filling of the heart takes up more time than actually contracting the heart. Yes, 2/3 is diastole and 1/3 is systole, if you remember, at rest, that is. So it makes sense that the average of the overall average of the system of blood pressure would reflect more the diastole of the system than the systole. This is another way of understanding it. Okay. Now, these are basically the two main components, and I want you to, I'll repeat it a couple of times. This formula you need to remember, and not just remember, understand it from this diagram, which you have seen again in lecture 1 as well. Blood pressure is a product of cardiac output and total peripheral resistance. So blood pressure, i.e., let's go back to the basics. Blood pressure in arterial tree here is a product. It is depending on what it gets from the heart, that is cardiac output, and what is the resistance or the capacitance of this tree itself, which is the TPR. Okay, so if you increase the cardiac output and keep the peripheral resistance constant, what will happen? The blood pressure would rise. Okay, if you keep the cardiac output constant and you were to increase by constricting the arterioles, you were to increase the TPR, what would happen? The blood would start pooling in the arterial side, and that will increase the pressure. We say that the blood pressure has increased. Okay. If you really increase the profile of the heart, the contractility, the blood pressure really increases. But for that, you need to also release this resistance a bit. This is something that we'll touch upon later on. Coming back to the operative slide. So basically, cardiac output is the main determinant, one of the main determinants. Because this is when blood volume is introduced into the arterial system. So cardiac output is this, and arterial compliance is measured by total peripheral resistance. As I just explained, these are the two things which basically determine your blood pressure. Okay. Um, some two minor points here is blood volume. If somehow you have gotten a transfusion, or uh, Allah forbid, there is blood loss, so you have decreased volume in your circulation, blood pressure will fluctuate accordingly. So more blood volume, more blood pressure; less blood volume, less blood pressure. This is obvious. Distribution of blood, again, this is a point, minor point. The distribution of blood, where is more of the blood located? You know, the whole blood volume is 5 liters, right? So out of this 5 liters, how much at any given time is in the arteries, and how much is in the veins? You know that veins, I beg your pardon, the veins have a reservoir function. They hold up blood as well, because they're also called capacitance vessels. So at any given time, what is the distribution of blood? This also affects blood pressure. This whole thing, have we done this slide? We have. So mean arterial pressure is directly proportional to cardiac output and resistance. This is the cardiac output, and this is the resistance against which this blood will flow out. This is the inlet, this is the outlet. If you constrict the outlet, the blood pressure will go up. If you increase the input, the blood pressure will go up, and decreases have corresponding opposite effects. This is a nice diagram to provide you the summary of what we discussed: mean arterial pressure. This is the heart, this is the TPR, this is the blood volume, this is that relative distribution. Okay, take a moment to see some more details. And this, let me tell you, this is how the circulation system is, and this is why, if you don't, if you if you were to cram this unit, it is it is highly undesirable, and it will actually, in a conceptual viva or a conceptual MCQ, you just can't do it. Because look, everything gets determined by something, which in turn is getting determined by, say, two other things. Check this out first. Mean arterial pressure, we said that it depends on blood volume, right? Nobody told us that blood volume itself is getting determined by two, three things. This flow chart gives you that information too. So this is the kind of depth in information that you need to have to make the whole concept, which is the right thing to do, so that A, your knowledge is complete, B, the assessment does not cause you trouble. If you only were to rote memorize this primary relationship, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and if a question comes up which derives from this information and asks this information, you will have absolutely no clue, because that may not even mention the keyword, say, blood volume. So say you have a scenario of blood loss, and the examiner asks you, how come fluid loss or blood loss lead to any change in mean arterial pressure? So basically the classical answer is, since blood volume is a determinant of mean arterial pressure, any decreases in fluid volume would lead to decrease in blood pressure. That's the way. Heart is another example. Heart pumping, cardiac output, stroke volume, cardiac output rather, is determined as we, cardiac output has has a whole chapter later on in Guyton. So we'll be dissecting it later on in that. But just quickly, cardiac output is basically a product of heart rate into stroke volume. Heart rate multiplied by stroke volume is cardiac output. So if the questioner asks you, what if heart rate, so he doesn't mention anything from this whole thing, just mentions heart rate. What if in a person you have just enough sympathetic stimulation to cause a rise in heart rate? What will happen to his mean arterial blood pressure? So the answer is heart rate will increase cardiac output, and cardiac output would then lead to increase in mean arterial pressure. So you see the multi-layer cake that circulation is. This is one variable, this is another variable, and then this is another variable. These variables develop this variable, and then this variable affects the main variable. Uh, this is how most of circulatory mechanisms are layered. I usually say they are a multi-layer cake. So if you like cake, you're good. You're good to go. Okay. So study this properly. Pause the video. Go through it. Try to understand what's going on, and make your concept, please. Don't rote memorize these things. Okay. Right. We go on to. So this is a summary of factors influencing mean arterial pressure.